Hi everyone, it's story time and I'm going to read an extract from The Twits by Roald Dahl. I think you can just see the Twits there behind me. It's one of my favourite Roald Dahl books. I absolutely love it because it makes me laugh so much. And I'm just going to read the first bit, which if you remember a couple of years ago, I think I probably read in assembly, and it's just the bit where it describes Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit, because I just shut your eyes and imagine what you think they look like. Okay, here we go. What a lot of hairy men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it's impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this: how often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to a barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed? Or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know. But next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Ugh. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand, but in truth he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. Whether you can see him now. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly nail brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough, and there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hair, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel, and we quickly look more or less all right again. But a hairy man can't do that. We could also, if we're careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. Not so the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you'll notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it's impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you'd see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers and minced chicken livers and all the other disgusting things that Mr. Twit liked to eat. If you look closer still, oh, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen. If you peer deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you'd probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never went really hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you'll find out in a moment. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She didn't, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that, at any rate, would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Ew, take a look at her. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see her. Let me see. Can you see her there? Ugh, she's really not very attractive. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She'd had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, their face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and sticking out teeth. But if you have good thoughts, they'll shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand, she carried a walking stick, and she used to tell people this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot, and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it, like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. What horrible characters the Twits were. I wonder if any of you fancied drawing me a picture of what you think Mr. and Mrs. Twit might look like and sending it to me. I'd love to see it. Okay, or write a little story if you like about the Twits, Mr. Twit, Mrs. Twit. Okay, or just enjoy the story. And if you like it, and if you're good at reading, then you might want to carry on and read it. Mr. Twit, you can see it there behind. You can see Mr. and Mrs. Twit. For some reason, they're standing on their head, and you'll have to read the story to find out more about that. Okay, bye for now, everyone.